Welcome everyone to Unit 5, the last unit of our climate change communication course. I am delighted that you are back and that we come full circle in this unit to think about how do we know it's working? That's of course the intent of everything that you have learned here and what you want to achieve. And so in this unit, we will do what is quite unusual in the communication field, which is to actually evaluate how well it's doing, how well it's achieving the goals that you intended. As usual, we start with a little review of our course goals and to locate what we're doing in that. The question of how well communication is working and how do you know, that came up in the pre-training survey by some of you. And it, of course, goes right back to the very components of impactful climate change communication. So we're circling back to that particular goal, but of course, all aspects of what we have done, what you say, how you say it, that it's audience specific, all of those things are part of making it effective, right? So let's take a quick look at where we are in this bigger picture. You see here, we've come to the end of the arc of our training, where we focus on evaluation and look for meaningful indicators that would tell you that it is working. So that's quite a challenge in and of itself, this whole evaluation business. Maybe some of you are trying to do that in the rest of your work. So many of the principles that I'm going to be talking about today are actually they're not unique to climate change communication per se. They are maybe in what you focus on, but how to do that and what to consider in that context, that might be familiar to you if you have done evaluation before. And if you haven't, I hope that you walk away from this coming to understand how crucially important evaluation is. A quick review of what we've done in the last unit, just so we can, tie things together, remind you where you were. After talking about what to say and how to put emotion into it, in this last unit, we were very focused on the opportunities and forms and depth of engagement, how active you can make that, and what communication channels in particular you would use. And of course, we looked at some of the traditional, the social media that are so important in your context, and also the more common forms of engagement using passive platforms or very active engagement in dialogue. And tying that, and you have done that seamlessly, tying to that, who is the right person to actually convey what we have to say? Sometimes that's you, sometimes it's not you. And as you have noticed, that can actually make you iterate around again and think about, is that really the goal we're trying to achieve? Do we have the right audience? And so you go around a few times, and that is just the work there is. A good communication strategy is not born out of a one round through this. It is born out of iteration through considering each one of these factors in impactful communication. To deepen into that, you have looked at the ways in which you can engage people and how you can make that more active. We talked about that today in our Zoom meeting, as well as talking about communication channels, the media you might use, from the conventional to the very creative, and the messengers, identifying the right ones, really thinking about who is most influential. And then, as many of you have already done, integrating all of these pieces from across the 4 units into sort of a 2-page summary. Of course, it's very short for all the conversations you've had, but this is just for me to get a sense of what you worked on. If you haven't sent it in, please do right away so I can get comments back to you by the end of this course, which is next week. So make sure that you send it to us, send it to Michelle or myself, and we'll make sure that you all get comments back. What we want to do today is to think again about these elements of impactful climate change communication that are really associated both with the strategy, the actual communication strategy you choose, but also with your organizational capacities to deliver. I want to go over both of those because, quite frankly, we can come up with the greatest communication strategy and then we just don't have any resources, any staff capacity to pull it off. And that might very well be a reason why things aren't working out as well as they might. And then we're going to go into evaluation. I'm going to introduce a few fundamentals. For those of you who are familiar with evaluation, that'll be a quick review, but it's also quite a confusing field. People use terminology differently. So I just want to introduce you the terms, how I use them and how I work with them. I want to talk about why do we do that in the first place? Why do we often not do that? Unfortunately, that is the case. And then go into developing your own theory of change, your own sort of graphic depiction, your action logic model of why you do what you do based on what assumptions and to what results that leads, which is basically the foundation for then coming up with indicators and metrics. So all of this, in my mind, is for you to reflect on, what you are doing, to see whether you can actually see change happening with the communities that you're trying to engage. And then at the very end, I want you to actually reflect a little bit on your own learning in this course, which, quite frankly, I think to me is the most important. That will be my immediate way of knowing whether or not you feel this has been worth your time. So let's jump in. Evaluating communication effectiveness. So this is a graphic you have seen every time in every unit, at least once. It is what we're trying to evaluate, right? Whether or not we have done our best in the communication, whether or not we are achieving the social changes and actions that we want our audiences to take, but of course also whether or not we have elevated people's motivation to take these actions and help them lower their resistance or barriers to action. So in some ways, communication has to address all of these things, and evaluation has to address all of these things. This is what we have talked about this entire course. What are some of the core elements of an impactful climate communication? This is something that I think is scalable from the very local, the interpersonal, all the way to the national, and if you are engaged in that by any chance, in international campaigns. As we've talked about, this is about connecting to and redefining the self-interest of your audience to really pick them up from whatever they're concerned with to making climate change personal. So that has to happen in these communication strategies. Making the causes and impacts and solutions visible for people, I think, is a crucial element. Most people still don't understand exactly how climate change works. It's an abstract thing. It's a distant thing in their minds. It's, oh, that happens in 100 years from now. And in some ways, we need to connect those causes, the impacts, and the solutions so that people can see how their actions actually might make a difference, whether that's on mitigation or on adaptation. And you know how many obstacles are between people getting that there is local erosion, and that it has something to do with what they use, what everyone uses in their households, how they get to work, how they drive to church, right? So making that whole causal chain from cause to impact and actions to mitigate and adapt visible is a really crucial piece of the communication. Purpose. Why should people act? Framing the issue as something that is, yes, can be related in a way to their self-interest, but in many ways, those deeper motivations, the things that really keep us going for a long time, they're often linking these personal concerns with some bigger aspirations, some ways, a common purpose, a larger good, something higher than our own little worlds or our own self-interest. Very often you need to make actions much easier. That's one of the biggest sources of the barriers and resistance, that it's not clear to people what they need to do. They don't know how. So giving them the assistance, making it clear that this needs to happen now, not in 10 years from now or done by somebody else, helping people feel empowered. Something I heard a lot in the challenges that you're facing. People are fatalistic. People expect somebody else to take care of things. Well, you helping people to see that they have power over their own lives, even if they, yes, cannot, nobody can change the entire global problem, right? But helping people see what they can affect and helping them do that now, that's a package deal. And oftentimes it goes with helping people see that they're not alone. Part of the overwhelm of climate change is that we are one person, any one of us, and we're faced with this overwhelmingly big global issue. Like, everybody could lose hope right there. But if you can see how everyone has a role to play and how everyone does play into it, then you can create a sense of the collective, a sense of unity and power that comes from doing it together. That requires hope. That is an essential element, and hope can come from a number of sources. We've talked about that in Unit 3, but it has to have a vision of a worthwhile outcome for the people that you're talking to. There's got to be a lot of social support and feedback that tells them it's working, you're doing the right thing to that higher purpose. Oftentimes it requires that we put in place enabling conditions, something that enables people to take the right action, whether that's a policy, whether that's an infrastructure, or whatever the case may be. Sometimes the enabling condition is other people, right? And then to stay with it. You will not solve climate change, and you know, I'll know this, in one campaign with one issue. So many in your strategies have already talked about, well, first we have to do this, and then we're going to do this, and once we have them in awareness, then we can take the next step. You can see how it builds. You think of yourself as being part of a large movement that will stay with it for decades. And that's how, you're building the blocks one step at a time, and other people are helping with you. And in each one of these, you can see how that reflects some of the challenges that we talked about in the early units on communication, about the motivations and barriers, and how to create social change on the ground. So all of these aspects are part of that impactful communication. That's just a review, just to remind you of what is it we're looking for. But there's the other piece, which is around how do you deliver something like that? I mean, just even think about this creation of a campaign that stays in place, or that is, a part of a long-term campaign. Well, that takes staff capacity, that takes funding, right? So in addition to you being much more clear about the strategic approach to your audience, taking the latest social science into account in shaping your communication, not, as we've said many times, not just the climate science is important, but the social science about communication and behavior change and organizational change, policy change. How do we know what's the best approach to do that? And then using that information, as we have done in this course, to design our strategy, to integrate it into a coherent, cohesive strategy, maybe working with others. Oftentimes we can't do this alone, and you have done this in many ways, thinking about who you need to reach out to get champions, to get a foot in the door with certain audiences, committing to it for the long haul, and then actually have the funding. Those are sort of organizational aspects of making it happen, making it succeed. And so then the question comes, okay, looking at both the strategy itself and how well we're doing with that, and with that strategic organizational setup, if you will, to actually implement it, a question then might arise, well, so what part of that are we actually evaluating? The strategy that you worked on is that piece around, what you have just basically laid out and sent to me. And then, of course, outside beyond that is the issue or challenge that you want to address, whatever social change you want to achieve. Sometimes, you look in either place for when you start to evaluate. You look at, have we moved the needle on that challenge at all? And some communication is actually just focused on, did you deliver the strategy the way you intended? So these are critical questions. There's some evaluation that looks at, has our communication actually contributed to that change in any way? And you might be the one looking, But what if you hired an external evaluator who looks at what you're doing and maybe, looks at how well you've achieved those goals? It's interesting to think about who should evaluate. If you're looking, will you be as honest with yourself? If someone else is looking from outside in, will they have as much information? Have they all the inside information they need? It's a big question, right? So who gets to say what's working and, who's involved in evaluation? Those are some important questions to answer in an evaluation. There is the issue of, will this external evaluator look at both, at our efforts, at the change in the world? Are we just looking at ourselves and not even looking at what happened outside beyond ourselves? I mean, these are the kinds of questions that you have to think about. And of course, then there comes the question of, to what extent is the outside world maybe also changing and has affected our communication. So you can see there's a lot of different angles you can take on evaluation. Another one is the question of when and how often are we evaluating? You might just do your communication strategy, deliver it, and do an evaluation right after, like, at the end of the engagement, at the end of the campaign. And you will see some immediate impacts then and there, and you can judge it. But, what if maybe some of the impacts that you might discover only unfold over time, months later, a year later? Well, should you go back? Can you still say anything about how well that's attributable to what you did way back when? Difficult questions, right? But certainly for some things, you can't evaluate effectiveness or see the outcome in the social world right the minute after you close, a public meeting. That's just the first step. So those are important questions to think about. Another thing that I want to just lay out as, just to kind of, not to confuse you, but to sort of, paint the landscape for evaluation, because there are a lot of terms out there. People use it in really different ways, and in each case, the emphasis of the evaluation is slightly different, and you might want to choose this more deliberately. So, for example, there might be types of evaluation that are distinguished by what they focus on. Are they focused on that process, say the inputs and the activities and outputs that you produced with your communication, or on the outcomes? So short, medium, long term, however long. By the timing. So sometimes evaluation is called formative. Oftentimes that's, otherwise known as a needs assessment. It basically looks at what is the situation right now, what is most needed, and assessing that situation before you go into developing a strategy. And, as is often needed, if you want to see whether or not you made a difference, well, you need to know difference against what? Against, based on what were the preliminary conditions or the initial conditions from which I started. So a baseline evaluation, maybe an interim evaluation after a few months or a year, and then maybe a summative evaluation that looks really at the whole achievement once it is concluded, maybe at the end of 5 years or something of that nature. Depends obviously on the project and the effort. So the timing is, and the purpose in that's embedded in that is really important way to distinguish different types of evaluation. We just talked about the evaluator's position. So whether or not it is, say, you in your organization are evaluating your own communication effort, that would be an internal evaluation. An external one is if you, hire a consultant to do that for you or some external person. And a participatory one is some kind of a mix where both internal people who were involved in implementing a strategy and people who were maybe affected or who had some perception of what you were doing on the outside are involved with you in the evaluation. Another question might be is, well, what is it actually that is being evaluated? Is it the one-time project, a campaign, or an effort? Or is it a whole program? Say, communication as part of capacity building, or a set of trainings, or communication as part of a research program. Some of you in the academic environment might find that a really important context in which to evaluate how well you're doing it. There's also a way to think about evaluation by how it is used. So sometimes evaluation, and this is probably the kind that most of you have an allergic reaction to, is the more traditional kind that basically says, well, did you do what you said you were going to do? Let's check how well you performed, right? This is the accountability or performance focused evaluation. There's other kinds that are really not so different necessarily in how they are done, but in really thinking very clearly about, well, okay, we can do this evaluation, and then what? What are we going to do with it? Very utilization focused. Say you are intent on trying to learn something about your audience, or trying to learn something about the policy landscape, or you're trying to learn something about how well your training is going or something like that. So you're really interested in making use of that evaluation in a very deliberate fashion. And oftentimes when we do that, we involve the end users of the evaluation much more directly in the evaluation effort. Today in the Zoom meeting, a suggestion came up to involve stakeholders to co-design a strategy. Well, it's the same idea. It's the idea of using the end users of the evaluation and bring them in the beginning to say, okay, what are you going to do with this? What do you want to know? And so therefore, what is it that should be done in this evaluation? What should we look at? So that's a utilization focused one. Developmental or principles focused evaluation, that's really more about not evaluation so much as where someone sits separately from you and looks over the shoulder, if you will, but it's almost like coaching. It's almost like someone who is sitting next to you. You're trying something new, and they give you very rapidly an ongoing feedback on, let's see if that actually achieved what you tried to do. So especially when you're trying something new, and when you want rapid feedback, not wait 5 years or even 1 year to get an evaluation report from someone, delivered to you, but when you want constant feedback on whether or not a complex, innovative approach that you're taking is working, that's when you would use developmental evaluation. I'm not going to go into great detail on what that all means, but you get the idea that, depending on how you plan to use it, you might do these evaluations very differently. And then the last one, and that's, if you will, sort of the holy grail, is the way you design the evaluation. Sometimes we are in a luxurious situation of actually being able to run an experiment. Well, let's try it in 2 ways. One group gets this type of strategy and the other group gets this type of strategy. And you can see what impact each one has and compare it and then say, well, that worked really well for this and this and this reason, and this one worked well for this, but not so well for the other reasons. So, this is a very unusual situation. In most instances, we don't have the luxury of setting ourselves up for an experiment. Sometimes you have that almost accidentally, where something was done in one place and with one community, and a different approach was used with a different community, and it wasn't really designed as an experiment, but it happened to be a quite comparable situation. And then you can learn from assessing the differences in impact that were achieved. Most of the time, you will have these one-time experiments, right, where you try one thing, and that's all you're ever going to do, and you just want to learn as much as you can from did it work? Did it have the impact that we wanted to have? Now, you might say, that's a lot of choices. Why would we want to do an evaluation of our communication efforts in the first place? There are, I would think, 5 reasons. And actually, there are 5 reasons that I've encountered again and again and again of why people want to do evaluation for anything, whether it's the success of, adaptation, or whether it's the success of a disaster reduction strategy or anything. In this instance, I'm going to focus on why you want to evaluate the effectiveness of communication. Well, and the first and foremost one is to actually improve your communication and engagement with the audience. But not necessarily, I'll come back to that in a moment here about just learning, we'll come back to that, but because sometimes, communicating what you want to achieve with your stakeholders and demonstrating to them that it's working, creating and reinforcing a social norm, those kinds of things can be in and of itself important reasons to do an evaluation. You basically want to bring your communication, your evaluation results back to your audience and, and essentially say, look guys, we did this campaign. It worked like a charm. Now so many more people are doing whatever the behavior is that you had intended them to do. And by doing that, you are telling people that this is now, not only are you telling other communicators, this apparently worked, hint, 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 but you're telling the audience that, oh, now more people are doing what we pioneered here, what we tried. And so they feel better about themselves and they feel not alone in their effort. And it reinforces the exact thing that you wanted to achieve, which is to create a norm that acting on climate change is a normal thing to do. Another really important reason to think about evaluation of your communication strategy is for your own internal planning and decision-making purposes. When you set clear goals and align your means and ends as you did in your strategy, then obviously you have, that's much better planning of your own efforts. It's far more likely to succeed having thought so carefully through it. And you're internally consistent with, in your strategy. That was what we tried to achieve in this 2-page summary that you all prepared. But let's say you're in one department and you have to coordinate whatever you're doing with several other departments. Having this strategy and having an evaluation that says it's working will make it easier for you to coordinate with other departments because they have something to look at and you have the evidence to show to them this is actually working, guys. So you're beginning to align across these typical silos, right? Across agencies, departments, partner organizations, and you come with the evidence to show that it's working. And then you can align your goals. You can align your efforts. You can align your strategy. So internal and external consistency with evidence in hand is simply made easier if you actually do a formal evaluation. Very often, and you will know this from many development aid agencies, is you need to fundraise, you need to justify why are you spending any money on this, and you need to argue for why you're allocating resources in the way you do. Well, how do you know that? How can you make that case convincing? When you do an evaluation and you can show, or you even say, we're including an evaluation and we will come back to you and show you that this is working better than anything else we've done. In my experience, it makes a funding proposal more compelling because funders are concerned with wanting to make sure that the money is spent in a good way. So evaluation can actually help you not only to make your argument, but even when you just propose to do an evaluation, it is more convincing to funders. And then you go back to them and show them, look, here's what we did and here's what we achieved. Sometimes that's important to bring back to your bosses, to your stakeholders, to your partners, for all the reasons I just explained above. And then finally, just simply for learning. And think about that for a moment. In most strategies being implemented, something doesn't quite work as you thought it would. Now, you might not feel comfortable telling your boss about it. You might not feel willing to tell your funders about it, but wouldn't you be interested in wanting to know and why something didn't work so that you don't make that same mistake another time? Well, so you can see in each one of these reasons for doing evaluation, you might actually be willing to look at different things. In number 5 here, when you're looking to learn, you're interested in failure. I've heard it many, many times from evaluators. I've heard it many times from people working out in the world. They would love to learn about what hasn't worked. I'm part of a conference organizing committee right now, and we're looking to include sessions on failure, massive failures, just because people want to learn. So this is not something to be afraid of, although I realize, and oftentimes you would not necessarily share that with the outside world in a competitive funding environment and whatnot. You know, you wouldn't wash this laundry out in the open, but you might want to know anyway. So think about, these types of questions you might have and what you're most interested in, of what motivates. Well, with all those good reasons to do evaluation, how come we so often don't? Well, here is that reason, or the set of reasons. For most people, it seems utterly time-consuming and tedious, and they think that evaluation basically takes away time from the more important work they do. I understand that, except that you miss all the opportunities for learning, which could possibly waste all the rest of your efforts if you don't understand why something does or doesn't work. You might do things that are completely waste of time. And of course, you wouldn't want that. So there is a really important attitude, I think, to have in a time of great change and great uncertainty, and where so much is at stake. And that is a learning attitude. So I really encourage you to think twice about whether or not it's not worth investing maybe a little bit of time, maybe by hiring someone who can do that work for you, and who can become, if you will, this coach alongside you to help you improve and become better and better at whatever you invest your time in. Many folks, think of evaluation as merely being about performance and accountability and essentially having someone watch over your shoulder and tell you it's good or not. So that, it's an understandable thing. But again, think about the many ways in which evaluation could be useful to you, and that there is more to evaluation than just a performance assessment. That's unfortunately what so often it gets reduced to. But just like communication, some people think of communication as the last thing that they need to do, and it is not very effective because of that. But you have just spent several weeks thinking about how to make this an integral part and an effective part of whatever else you do. And in the same way, I want to invite you to think of evaluation as just another wheel on your wagon to help you do whatever you do much more effectively. Sometimes people have said to me, we did all this work last year. I can't remember. And that's real. We have so many things on our plate. So, it's important often to design evaluations and tracking of what we're doing and how well we're doing, and thinking that through carefully so that you, at the end of the year or whenever you look back, don't all of a sudden, look at a blank wall, but to look at a number of really useful data still, to help you with that. Sometimes people don't know, why are we doing this? And who are we doing it for? Who wants to know? This is often a fear, that evaluation basically just is a report done at the end and it sits on a shelf and nobody ever looks at it. There's no follow-up to whatever you're tracking. So one of the lessons I have learned as an evaluator is that you always bring your evaluation back to the very people that you actually asked. So not just to the one who asked you to do the evaluation, say, a program manager or something like that, but you bring it back to the very people that you interviewed, that you surveyed, that you asked to give input. They want to know, so what did you find and what are you going to do with that? It's very important. It simply avoids this perception that evaluation is a useless exercise. It's also true that whatever you are doing to communicate an issue is just one influence of many on people, on communities, on policy. So it's often difficult to trace whatever you did directly back to the social process, the social change, the behavior change that you wanted to see. So, there's a balancing act between the simplicity of indicators and metrics, often if they're quantitative, and really reflecting the complexity of the situation you try to affect. So a mix of qualitative and story-based sort of ways of capturing what happened in combination with some more quantitative measures might be a most effective way to balance those two challenges. And, for many people who are asked to do evaluation, they're not trained evaluators. I think this is known widely in the evaluation field that most people who do evaluation have never, ever studied evaluation. I raise my hand. It's the same thing for me. It was not my background, but I was asked to do it, and I just acted like a good social scientist and tried to understand a situation. And, over time learned a lot about how to do evaluation well. So if you don't have that expertise, don't despair. You can A, learn it on the job, and B, you can get help from people who are far more experienced and expert than you from the outside. So it is absolutely possible to do a minimal amount, if you will, of critical thinking about whether or not you have achieved what you set out to achieve. And that's better than nothing. This is not a thing about perfection here. We're not aiming for perfection in this class and evaluating it. We're aiming for you to understand why it could be a really helpful thing for you. And, for some of the things that we try to do, there are also only very bad metrics. So this is where it actually gets, for me personally, most interesting. Can we come up with something more creative, more useful, something that is truly meaningful and would tell you we made a difference? So it's perceived to be hard, this whole evaluation thing. It doesn't have to be. It can be actually really, really interesting, and you learn a ton. So I hope that, you will overcome whatever resistance you have. Think about all those layers of resistance and do it anyway. I'm going to invite you here to work with me, play through that. Let's look at some of these common metrics of effectiveness for communication per se. What's out there? And you probably have seen these and used them in your own words, in your own work. Related to communication products and outputs, that's typically what people can most easily come up with. Say the number of talks you have given, or the workshops held, or how many pamphlets you printed and distributed to your audience, the number of press releases per year, number of reports or brochures produced, and maybe sometimes you even are interested in whether or not you delivered it on time. That's the typical stuff, right? Or in relation to engagement, when we don't really know how better to assess outcomes, we might look at things like how many people visited the website, how many downloaded this report that we put up on it. We send out a MailChimp email and we can track the percentage of emails opened. Beware, we've done this with you. We know. So this is the kind of stuff that Google Analytics just gives you so easily, right? Or you can even find out how much time people spent on different web pages on your site, indicating that you got some interest here. You might have just tracking how many people you have reached or the range of audiences, so it's a little more qualitative measure here. How many exhibits you went to, how many press hits you got, and what I mean by that is earned media, right? It's not the article you yourself get into the newspaper, but somebody writes about you, your effort, without you basically doing much for it. Sometimes people look for evidence that a particular communication or something you put out has been a factor, at least, in seeing a particular policy change or behavior change. Much more tricky, but those are the kinds of things that you often see. So that's what's commonly out there. And I want to challenge us to think that we could do better than this. This is not, nothing. It's just really, really limited. And as you can see, it barely gets to the kind of social changes that you're interested in achieving. So a couple more basics before we jump into this. And the first of these basics is just to be clear, what do I mean by evaluation? The simplest way for me to say that is I want you to be able to assess the progress that you're making towards your goal against a particular baseline, and that you understand how, why not you achieved that goal. So you can see in that I'm very interested in that learning oriented reason for doing an assessment, doing an evaluation. I'm not particularly interested in just judging your performance. You're not going to get a grade on your communication strategy. I'm interested in seeing how well you're integrating the different components and evidence for learning and how it's changing your thinking and how you made adjustments because of what you learned. That's what I care about. And in the same way, I want you to think about evaluation as an aid in helping you do your communication ever more impactfully. One of the ways in which I think it's really important to think about that, and you've done this in some ways already. I'm just now giving you a term for it. You have thought very carefully about, if we do this, then we're going to do this, then we're going to achieve that, and that's going to ultimately lead to XYZ outcome. You have essentially laid out a causal chain of how your communication and your efforts to add passion and a particular framing and emotion and you adjusting and selecting the right channel and adjusting maybe your approach so that you can lower some of the barriers to action, how that is resulting in particular changes on the ground. You have essentially laid out a theory of change. And by that, I mean just simply your mental model of how you're going to try to affect change. You see here a number of definitions for this concept of a theory of change, a presentation of your assumptions about how changes are expected to happen, or this describing a process of planned social change, something that you're trying to intervene on, or a way of thinking through all the steps necessary along a path from the status quo right now to some kind of desired change. So those are the ways in which you can think about a theory of change. You have gone through that more or less consciously, and you might have, in your discussions with your training partner, bumped into, wow, she or he thinks completely differently about how this change happens than I do. Think back if that happened. It could have. I find that one of the most interesting things to become aware of, because how I think a change happens determines how I want to intervene in a situation and what I will do. And someone else might have a completely different conception of what they know about how change works. And maybe they're right, maybe I'm right, maybe we're both right. Maybe we can work together and integrate it. So oftentimes, thinking about communication and whatever you want to do there as part of this larger strategic effort that you're planning on, using other people's ways of thinking about, how do you think we can affect this situation? How do we think we can get to success? Can reveal so many useful insights that I just find it's the treasure trove, and it's the basis for all strategic thinking and all strategic planning. No one of us has gotten this right. Like, there is no one way only that the world works. And it's super helpful to bring people who come from very different walks of life into a meeting and say, let's think that through. And from that, build a more refined strategy that will help us to achieve our goals. And then, and this is, how evaluation links into that, once you have this theory of change laid out, and I'll show you a way of doing that in a moment, then you can actually figure out, okay, I want to know more about this and whether that happened and whether this happened and whether this happened. You essentially, with evaluation, then test your theory of change. You essentially, based on, you might go in with intuition, a gut feeling, and then you have the empirical opportunity to test it against what you actually did and what actually happened. And then you update your intuition. You essentially, as a result of this evaluation, this conscious search for evidence of every step along the way, whether that actually, occurred, that's how you then find out whether you're right, and you can make adjustments over time. How do we depict this theory of change? Well, you see one example here. It's a wild wire diagram where you basically connect, I do this, and then this happens, and this results here, and that leads to this step, and that's one way to do that. It's a little confusing, it's hard to trace, but it's possible, right, to think of it in this wild, wild way. There are more essentially formalized templates for it. I'll show you some, and you can use one in your exercise that I'm going to ask you to do in a moment. But essentially, an action logic model is just the graphic summary of your theory of change. That's all. It's that simple. It's not the same thing, but the action logic model is, if you will, a one-page graphic summary of all that intuitive thinking of how change will come about that you might discuss. So it typically lays out all these steps that you're taking and the outputs you're producing and who you work with and what that's going to lead to and how that's going to lead to the next step and the next step. So let me show you one example. This is one, you've probably seen it. It's all over the internet. It's one of the most simple ways of summarizing that, right? Where you begin with a sort of baseline assessment of where are we at and why are we focusing on what we're focusing the first place. You talk about inputs, what you all are putting in, and you can see how it's such a high-level summary of things, right? You might want to be much more specific in your particular action logic model. This is just giving you examples of the kinds of things people typically write into those boxes. And then you have a number of outputs, activities, participation, who you reach, that sort of thing. You might, on the bottom there, you see people write down the assumptions. You might assume that you have access to top policymakers or to neighborhood associations or to whoever, those champions that you envision. Some assumptions are really important to note down because, say, you might assume you get this grant from an organization to help you do this, and then that grant only didn't come through, or you got only half of it or something. So that obviously changes. And in an evaluation, you would want to know that. Well, we worked with half the money, or we had to completely change gears because the money came a half a year later and things didn't, then, we didn't have the same opportunities, right? So those are the important pieces to remember, if you will, once you do an evaluation. That's why you write those assumptions down. And then, of course, you summarize in one way or another the outcomes that you're achieving, sometimes called impact. I'm not particularly keen on making the big distinction here, but oftentimes what gets distinguished is what you can achieve first, and then in a little while, and then in the long term. And oftentimes that's distinguished by, changing knowledge, changing understanding, awareness raising, learning, and then getting to actions, and ultimately you are changing the conditions on the ground. So in the instance, with climate action, maybe it's environmental conditions, maybe it is social well-being, maybe it's public health, maybe it is economic development, or whatever the case may be. So, and of course they're logically linked in some ways, right? You first need awareness in order to act on it, in order to affect the change on the ground. Again, there might be a whole number of external factors that happen over the course of of a period. Like right now, Corona has, so it's an external factor. If you had launched a campaign, and this happened in the middle of it, well, you couldn't have accounted for that ahead of time because you didn't know it was coming. But it clearly is affecting economic recession, a disaster event that you might have planned for in sort of theoretical terms, but then it actually happened during the time you did something. You would want to note that because it can positively or negatively help you with your outcome. So that's just a one-page graphic summary. And I don't want you to focus mostly on this. I want you to actually focus more than anything on thinking through, why are you doing what you're doing? That theory of change. This is icing on the cake. So when I'm sending you off in a moment to your exercise, I want you to think through your theory of change with your partner through all these steps here. What resources, skills you need, what you will need to make your activity happen, what will happen before you get to the ultimate result, that sort of thing. So you work your way from the top to the bottom, or the bottom to the top. Actually in both directions, you might find different answers. So these are the kinds of things I want you to think through and then depict in a logic model. I have put several different templates into the Google folder. And if none of them work for you because it just doesn't fit your particular situation and what you want to achieve, make your own. I don't care. It doesn't matter at all. But I do want you to think through, very carefully why you're doing what you're doing, what you're putting in, and what you will achieve. And that will be then the basis for developing indicators of success and, seeing your impact on the world. So as you go along, I invite you also to just take notes on what is hard about this and what questions do you have, what benefits and opportunities and uses you could see for doing this kind of thing. And also if you have maybe any needs in terms of pulling that off, whether it's from me still in the rest of the course or from anyone else. So with that, I just want to invite you to go off and do this exercise, and in our next session, report back on these opportunities and challenges and questions that you might have. And I just simply now invite you to go do that. And then when you're done, come back to part 2 for the next step.